Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at a hypothetical 2024 presidential matchup between current Democratic President Joe Biden and Republican nominee, in this case, Governor Ron DeSantis from Florida. Now, most of my content, here until November is going to be midterm oriented, but I figure every now and then I'll throw in some 2024 content, whether it's a prediction every couple months or whether it's, relevant news, obviously, because obviously the midterms are coming up in about 9 months, a little less than 9 months. And, obviously that's going to be the focus of a lot of the content on the channel here. So anyway, let's get right down to it. So all the safe states I've currently filled out for either nominee. Of course, the my margin for safe states is 12 points or higher. In this situation, I have Alaska and South Carolina as safe states, as I think Ron DeSantis would win them both by 12 points or higher. In 2020, South Carolina just came up a little bit shy of 12 points. It was an 11.7% margin. I think certainly in this matchup, and again, this is based on if the election were kind of held today, so with Joe Biden's current approval, I don't think he'd be able to lose the state by less than 12 points. So that's why I have South Carolina. Similarly with Alaska as well. I just think this was purely part of the national environment shifting to the left. So anyway, we'll start on the West Coast and move over eastward, as I usually like to do. And we'll start out with the state of Nevada. So Nevada in 2020 was the only Clinton swing state in 2016 that Hillary Clinton won to actually shift to the right. I say that in almost every video because I think it's pretty significant, because all of the other so-called swing states in the 2016 election, states that weren't quite safe, like Minnesota, Virginia, Maine, Colorado, these states, by margin could have technically been swing states, but ended up going to Hillary Clinton nonetheless. All of these states moved to the left, New Hampshire as well. They all moved to the left with the exception of Nevada, which actually moved a little bit to the right. You could argue it's an insignificant shift, but I think this does mean something, particularly with Joe Biden's unpopularity with Latino voters, which make up a plurality of the voters in the state of Nevada. Of course, 2016, we saw basically the same margin for the Democrats. Donald Trump increasing his vote percentage from 45.5% to 47.7%. Joe Biden just being able to crack 50 there. So I think, given obviously our current national environment, I actually do think Nevada probably would be a tilt flip for Ron DeSantis. If Nevada were to flip for the Republicans, I think it would be very narrow. And I think that flip would come mainly in a place like Clark County. We could see a sort of Miami-Dade shift perhaps in the 2024 election. Now, Trump and DeSantis have their strengths and weaknesses, but I think one area where DeSantis will do well, as Trump did, comparatively to other Republican nominees, is his support with Hispanic voters. Now, obviously, they're not going to vote for him by a majority, but I think he's going to do better with them than, your average Republican would, as did Trump. And I think that would help him get over the finish line in Nevada, as well as white suburban voters that had kind of shifted away in the 2020 election, shifted away from Trump. Some of them might come back home to the Republican Party, and that would give the state to Ron DeSantis. Next state we're going to take a look at is the state of Arizona. Arizona, polling suggested for Biden was going to go anywhere from 3 to 4 points. It ended up being the second closest state in the entire country, only going to Joe Biden by 0.3%. While the national environment, the nation as a whole voted +5 in favor of Joe Biden, Arizona only voted 0.3%. So this was significant. This was the first time Arizona had voted for a Democratic presidential nominee since 1996. Although you kind of had the Ross Perot factor as well in there. So, really it is kind of debatable if Ross Perot had any factor on Bill Clinton winning the state. But nonetheless, Arizona is one of those ancestral Republican states. This is a state that Republicans have been doing well in for decades. Democrats, obviously, every now and then would win a governorship or there, but it was mostly a Republican-leaning state. And this time it was a little bit different, and that was mainly due to the shifts we saw in Maricopa County. Now, this also happened on the Senate level. Again, I think part of it does come down to one poor nominee, and that was, of course, Martha McSally in the Senate race. But obviously, the top of the ticket tends to have the most influence, and Donald Trump was not popular in the state of Arizona. It had never really been too popular in the state of Arizona among general election voters. Obviously, among Republicans, he was very popular, but he failed to make inroads in the suburbs and with white college-educated voters, which ultimately lost him the state. Of course, this was a state that he won by 3.5 points back in 2016. A very small margin for a state like Arizona, but still a lean victory nonetheless. Now, based on Biden's approval rating and based on the shifts that I expect to see in 2024 if the election were held today, I do think Ron DeSantis as the nominee would probably end up winning Arizona probably by around 3 points. I would think maybe a 51-48% margin. Now, that might be a little bit drastic, but you have to understand that the state of Arizona particularly is still a Republican state. I still consider it a lean Republican state. It's a state that by default tends to like to elect Republicans over Democrats. It just had a really unfavorable view of Donald Trump as a nominee, for character reasons or whatnot. So, the populace as a whole in Arizona is still conservative. Joe Biden is very unpopular. Make no mistake of it, Arizona is still shifting to the left. Now, obviously, if there's a more dramatic shift in 2024, maybe that'll change things. But as of right now, Arizona is a state that is shifting to the left. It's expected to have competitive races in the Senate and the governorship in 2022. I think Ron DeSantis would be able to win it by a lean margin. Next, we're going to go to Colorado. We're not going to talk too much about this state. I really wanted to talk about it just because it was a state that was once considered a swing state. 2016, Hillary Clinton won this state by around 5.1%. Similar margin to what she won in Virginia. If we go to 2020, the result was drastically different. We saw a 55-41 margin, almost 42%. This is a margin we would expect in a state like New Mexico, but New Mexico actually voted to the right of Colorado. And Colorado didn't vote that much to the right of a state like Oregon, which is where I think its political future is headed. So I think whether DeSantis is the nominee or not, I just think the population shifts in the state of Colorado is going to make it a solidly blue state. I don't think Republicans are going to be that competitive in the state going forward. I could be wrong, but I think it's unlikely that they recapture any chambers of the legislature in 2022. But it could happen. But I don't think it's as likely. Moving on down to New Mexico, I think New Mexico will be closer than the state of Colorado, again, like we saw in 2024. Now, really depending on where Biden's approval rating stands and what the sentiment is, I really want to see what happens in New Mexico in 2022. Not that that's going to have a huge impact on the general election results. I still think it's going to be a solidly Democratic state. However, I do think Biden is going to lose ground in New Mexico. He won the state by, over 10 points, almost 11 points. I think that margin is going to shrink considerably. I think he'll probably only end up holding on to New Mexico by around 8 points in this current situation, which still makes it a likely blue state, but I think Joe Biden will actually hold on in the state of New Mexico. Moving on up to the Nebraska's congressional district, its second congressional district. This is a district that is very swingy. Obama won it in 2008 narrowly. Romney recaptured it. Of course, Trump won the district again in 2016 and then went on to lose it in 2020 by around 7 points. Now, I certainly think that Ron DeSantis is a better candidate for the suburbs. He doesn't have the baggage that Trump has. He also has a long list of accomplishments for GOP voters that would certainly, I think, gin up turnout in these suburban areas where, Republican gains have been lacking. I think Ron DeSantis would be able to take back Nebraska's second congressional district. I still think it would be narrow. The suburban shifts are not going to be reversed by a Ron DeSantis run. And this probably would more be Joe Biden failing than Ron DeSantis succeeding at this rate. So I think this would end up going to DeSantis probably by 1.5 points, maybe 2 points, similar to what we saw in 2016. Now moving on down to Texas, this is a really tough state to decide the margin for, because I would say Ron DeSantis has nearly a certain chance of winning Texas in 2024 if Biden is the nominee, based on our current trajectory, of course. He's not a popular nominee. He's a little bit more popular than Trump was at this point in his presidency, but it really is getting close. His unfavorables are very high. But I do think that Texas, this is a state that Republicans have only been getting around 52% in the last two general elections. They've got 52.2 in 2016 with Trump winning the state by 9, and then Biden going on to win the state by lose the state by only like 5.5 points. So a considerable shift to the left, particularly in the suburbs. I think Ron DeSantis is the type of candidate that would make inroads in the suburbs considerably, probably especially these northern suburbs here. Obviously in places like Austin, those are still going to be solidly liberal, and you're not going to see too much of a shift to the right there, but I think certainly in the Houston area, maybe even Dallas-Fort Worth, you're going to see a shift back, possibly win places like Tarrant County, obviously do well in places like Corpus Christi. Southern Texas remains a mystery of how strong Ron DeSantis will be down there, but I think it's probably going to end up being a likely state, maybe about 7 points, but I still think Texas is going to be in this odd, phase where, it's not quite a safe Republican state, but it's not going to go Democratic either. So I don't think it's actually going to be a safe Republican state. I still think at the end of the day, just due to demographic change, the shifts we have in the suburbs, the shifts among white college-educated voters, I think it will still be a likely state. Maybe I'm being a little bit conservative in my estimate, but I think probably about 7 points in favor of Ron DeSantis. And when I mean conservative, I don't mean right wing. I just mean I'm being cautious about how much I want to rock the boat in Texas. Moving on up to Minnesota, I still think Joe Biden would win the state of Minnesota, probably by a lean margin, maybe around 5 points or so. But again, you have to factor in unpopularity. But states like Minnesota are still going to vote for Democrats, whether they're popular or not. I think 2016 would have been the year for Minnesota to flip, but I think now the metro area has moved too far in favor of the Democrats for the state to really be flippable for them. So Democrats still have a firm grip of power in Minnesota, and that's one of the reasons why I think it's going to continue to stay blue, unless, obviously things change, but this is how I see 2024 going right now for the state. Iowa, I think Iowa would actually be a safe state for Ron DeSantis, and the reason I say that is because Ron DeSantis is a different sort of Republican than Trump is. I think he has a higher appeal, would have a higher appeal among evangelicals, which are a huge constituency in Iowa, strangely enough. Iowa's not a southern state, but it does have a very large evangelical population. And I certainly think he'd win Iowa in the primary, but I also think he'd win it in the general, probably by around 12 points. Again, we saw Donald Trump win the state of Iowa by 10 points back in 2016. Iowa has since shifted further to the right, only going a bit more to the left in 2020 with Joe Biden, but again, it was still a 53 to 44.9 margin, basically 53-45, roughly an 8-point margin in favor of Trump. Given the national environment, it didn't shift as much as the rest of the nation. So I certainly think in 2024, Iowa would probably be safe and honestly not a state that Dems should really contest. I think Democrats' efforts to win the presidency really run through the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt, with maybe like North Carolina possibly, although if I was a Democratic strategist, I wouldn't focus too much on North Carolina, given its track record for voting Republican in general elections continuously. Wisconsin was the third closest state in the 2020 election. We saw Wisconsin go to Joe Biden by 0.6%, so Donald Trump lost the state by 0.6%. This was a state that Donald Trump won by 0.7%. So the margin was super, super close in the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin voted to the right of the nation, as did Michigan, as did Pennsylvania. So almost all the swing states that had a huge effort by the Trump campaign, they all voted to the right of the nation. However, it didn't really make a difference in the end. They still went toward the Democrats. I think due to this close margin itself, I think Ron DeSantis would probably take back Wisconsin. He would do better in the WOW counties of Wisconsin, doing better in these white-collar, white working-class suburbs here. He'd probably do a little bit worse in rural Wisconsin, but I think Joe Biden's rural bleed will continue, especially in the Rust Belt, given the track record of his first term, failure to get a lot of big policy agendas passed that would probably have made the Rust Belt look at him more favorably. I think in 2024, that's going to be a huge detriment for Joe Biden. So I think Wisconsin would probably go by a tilt margin. Michigan is a really tough state to gauge because at this rate, I would say Michigan goes red. But I'd say if Joe Biden improves his numbers a bit by 2024 in this hypothetical, I actually think Joe Biden would win the state of Michigan still. But because of where we see the country right now, Joe Biden's approval rating, if the election were held today, I think he would lose the state of Michigan very narrowly. I think it'd be maybe less than a point, maybe a point or so at most. But I think Ron DeSantis would be able to win back the state of Michigan for the GOP. So far we have 4 flips on the map here. Of course, we have Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Michigan all flipping to Ron DeSantis in this hypothetical. Ohio is, was a swing state. I don't really consider it a swing state anymore. Similar to Virginia. It's basically the Republicans' version of Virginia. Was a swing state in 2012. After 2016, really didn't become a swing state. I read some ridiculous articles that said Ohio was going to flip in 2020. Even if Joe Biden won the popular vote by 7 points, I didn't think that was going to happen. Even if Joe Biden did considerably better in some of these swing states, I didn't think Ohio was going to flip. This is a state that Donald Trump won by 8 points in 2020 and in 2016, and in 2020 the margin was basically the same. Winning it by 8.1%. So Ohio overall, again, there was still a huge shift to the right in southern and northeastern Ohio. There's still room to grow for the GOP in these areas. And again, I think Ron DeSantis is somebody who would have a better appeal in a place like Delaware County, a suburban county that, was 7 points away from flipping blue, while also holding on to rural Ohio, which at this point, you're starting to see a shift away from just Trump in these rural areas and just a shift, sort of an anger toward Democrats as a whole, which, may have existed in some way or form for decades in the U.S. in rural areas. But I think the rural areas, as we saw with the victory of Glenn Youngkin in 2021, continually are moving away from the Democrats, even when Trump really isn't a factor. So I think that's going to continue to play out with Ron DeSantis on the ballot. I think he'll win Ohio probably by around 7 or 8 points. I don't really see a giant shift either way. The reason why I don't think Ohio is going to shift massively to the right is because it still has fairly blue cities that I think will anchor it down, preventing Ohio from really becoming a safe red state, at least for the next couple cycles. So that's why as of right now, I still have this as a likely GOP state. Moving on, we'll go up and we'll go down the eastern seaboard. Moving on up to Maine, Maine in 2020 was a 9-point margin for Joe Biden. A pretty decisive margin, 9.1%. I don't really see Ron DeSantis doing considerably well in a state like Maine. I think Maine would probably stay likely Democratic. Again, the rural areas in Maine have shifted to the right. Especially we saw that evident in 2016. I'm pretty sure every county in Maine shifted to the right in 2016 and did. In the 2020 election, we saw the coast area of Maine move considerably more to the left. And that's one of the reasons why Joe Biden won the state by as much as he did. Obviously, I think the 1st congressional district is probably going to be likely for Ron DeSantis. Maybe borderline safe, but again, the margin that the margin that Joe Biden gets in Maine's 1st district will be enough to anchor the state, probably in the likely category still for Joe Biden. I don't really see a whole lot of movement there. New Hampshire, now this is a somewhat controversial pick because I don't think New Hampshire is going to flip, but I think Ron DeSantis is going to improve considerably on Trump's showing in New Hampshire. New Hampshire, since 2016, never really liked Trump. Trump benefited from, might have actually been hurt, rather, by a third-party showing in Gary Johnson. Gary Johnson getting 4.1%. If you added that percentage to Trump's total, he would have gotten nearly a majority. Of course, third-party votes don't split that way, and don't let anyone tell you that. But I certainly think he was his margin as a whole was hurt by Gary Johnson in the state. That being said, in 2020 we saw Joe Biden obviously more favored than Donald Trump in the state of New Hampshire, even though a lot of polls said Joe Biden was not popular in New Hampshire, but neither was Trump, and it wasn't really enough for Trump to make considerable inroads. He lost ground in the state of New Hampshire. It was one of the few states where his raw vote percentage actually shrunk. We only saw that in other states like Massachusetts and Maryland, so it was really only deep blue states where we saw that. So I actually think Ron DeSantis will do better in this state. I think he'd probably only lose it by around 3.5, 4 points. I still think it's going to be a blue state, though. New Hampshire, as close as it gets in presidential elections, has been reliably Democratic since 2000, and I think it's going to continue that streak. Pennsylvania, I think, along with the rest of the Rust Belt, would end up flipping. It would be a narrow flip, I just think, because Pennsylvania, like Wisconsin, like Michigan, has, big blue cities in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. It has blue suburbs in the collar counties, and then it has sort of these swing areas in the northeastern part of the state that in 2020 swung towards Biden. In 2016, they swung away from Hillary Clinton, and they swung towards Donald Trump. Places like Northampton County, Erie County, Luzerne County. These were the three counties that flipped. And a lot of the blue counties, Monroe County, that Obama won by a safe margin. Again, we look at the shift. Monroe went 56-42 for Obama, and Trump almost won the county. He came within a point of winning the county. So we saw huge shifts in these areas. Lackawanna County, home to Scranton, Pennsylvania. Trump only lost this county by around 3 points. So this time around, Biden won it by 8. Now, that's a considerable shift, but when you look at how Lackawanna County voted in 2012 and 2008, 63-35, this is an inroad I don't think is going to change. I think Lackawanna County is going to be a likely Dem county, maybe even lean in the future because of these shifts. So that alone, I think Biden will lose a lot of ground in the eastern portion of the state, where really is where you saw the biggest swing in favor of him. I don't think his appeal is going to last. This was a state that he only won by 1.2%. Given the national environment now, I certainly think Pennsylvania will flip. Virginia, Virginia flipped red in the governor's race, but federal elections are very different than statewide elections. Donald Trump got 1.9 million votes in the state of Virginia. Glenn Youngkin only got 1.6 million. Terry McAuliffe got like 1.5 million something. So while the Republicans had the turnout edge in 2021, this last November, I don't think they're going to really be that competitive in the state going into 2024. Well, I think DeSantis probably will do better in the state, and maybe he'll have somebody like Glenn Youngkin campaigning for him. I still think at the end of the day, this is going to be a likely Democratic state, purely based on the trends that we have in Nova, the Richmond suburbs area. All the suburbs in Virginia have been trending blue. I think DeSantis probably will win places like Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, maybe Chesterfield and Stafford back. But the highest I would possibly see him getting is maybe 45.5% in the state, just given its shift towards the left, even despite Biden's unpopularity in this hypothetical. Moving on down to North Carolina. North Carolina is a state I think DeSantis will certainly improve over Donald Trump. I think he'll win the state by a lean margin. Donald Trump won it by a lean margin back in 2016, garnering 49.8% of the vote, just shy of a majority to Clinton's 46.2%. Won the state by 3.6%. In the 2020 election, Donald Trump won the state by 1.3%. So he lost about 2 points of ground. What really saved him actually was these rural shifts in these historically blue counties in the northeastern part of the state and the southeastern part of the state, shifting toward the right, while the cities like Raleigh, Charlotte, all these other areas shifted toward the left. So that kind of saved him in the state. If these shifts didn't happen, it might have possibly flipped in favor of Joe Biden. He won the state by less than 100,000 votes. That being said, Joe Biden's approval numbers are very, very poor in North Carolina. I think DeSantis, again, as a fresh face to the GOP, I think a lot of people, suburbanites who voted Democrat the past 4 years because they were sick of Trump, they didn't like Trump, some of them might come back home to the GOP. I could see DeSantis winning the state by around 3 points or so. Georgia is a state that's been shifting dramatically to the left the past few years. We went from 2016, where Donald Trump was winning the state by 5.1%, to a state where he loses by 0.3%. That's a 5.4% drop for Donald Trump. This is a state that, I really want to see what happens in 2022. But given the national environment, this was the closest state in 2020. I think it's very likely that DeSantis will win the Peach State, probably by a tilt margin. I think it's going to be a lot closer. It's probably going to vote to the left of a place like Arizona, a place like North Carolina, maybe even one of the Rust Belt states, probably the Rust Belt states, to be honest. It might be very close. We could see a 0.5 margin for Ron DeSantis here, but I think he just has a stronger appeal in the suburbs that will stop the bleeding, will stop the falling away of the GOP just enough for him to win back the state, do strong in the northern part of the state, and do slightly better, maybe hit 5 44 in Cobb or something like that. That would be enough for him to probably get a statewide win. So giving that to Ron DeSantis, he wins the presidency, but that's not all. We'll finally go to Ron DeSantis' home state of Florida, which, no shock, will go to Ron DeSantis. Now, this is really tricky, again, the margin, because Ron DeSantis, as of the making of this video, is a popular governor from Florida. You know, Florida was considered a swing state. You know, still is a relatively close state. It's not a state like Ohio that the Democrats should just give up on, although I will say the Florida Democratic Party has made many missteps that have made this state a lot more GOP friendly than it otherwise would have if you had a more competent Democratic Party down there. That being said, I think Ron DeSantis probably would end up winning the state by around 5 points in a presidential election. You know, we saw it go about like 3 points in favor of Donald Trump in 2020. I think Ron DeSantis will win it by 5. I don't think you're going to see a really dramatic shift like we saw in Ohio or Wisconsin. It could happen, but I don't think it's likely where you're going to see Florida vote to the right of Texas, let's say. I think as of right now, I think Florida would still probably be a lean state, going about 5 points in favor of Ron DeSantis. Again, he's governor of the state. He's relatively popular. It's a red state anyway. He's probably going to win it. So anyway, guys, that's all for today's video. We have Ron DeSantis winning 313 electoral votes over Biden's 225. That's slightly higher than Donald Trump's margin of victory over Hillary Clinton, 306 to 232. So anyway, guys, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a thumbs up down below. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.